All right, y'all. So we are going to get started with Unit 5, Topic 1, the Enlightenment. Now, remember, we've sort of grouped Topic 4.6 along with 4.7 and then these early parts of Unit 5 together, not because they match chronologically, right? Unit 4 is 1450 to 1750. Unit 5 is 1750 to 1900. So they don't match chronologically, but thematically, the theme of these sections kind of mesh together really well. 4.6 was challenges to state power, internal and external challenges to state power. 4.7, changes in social hierarchies. So you did a lot of those pyramid structures in your notes. How did social structures change? What was the changing roles of women, so on and so forth. And now we're going to get into Unit 5, which is, again, later on in time, but here in the early part of Unit 5, we're talking about revolutions. And so, first, Topic 1 is going to be the ideas that sort of fostered the revolution, the ideas of revolution, what motivated people, what changed the way people thought, and that is the Enlightenment. And then 5.2, we'll get into some of those revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian, the Latin American Revolution. So we'll talk about more of those as well as we start to see massive shifts as we get into more modern history. So make sure you have your notes with you, and let's get started. So first, what we need to do is really define what the Enlightenment is and what it was. The Enlightenment really is this intellectual and philosophical movement, right? This movement of thought and philosophy that sweeps across Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, so the 1600s and the 1700s. And it's really defined by this emphasis on reason, rationality, right? Rational thought, and the pursuit of knowledge, gaining knowledge, right? And you want to remember before this, like religion was the one that kind of held the thought, held the knowledge, was the gateway to knowledge and things like that. And this was about finding your own sense of that. Enlightenment thinkers, who are also known as philosophers, believed that human beings could use reason and critical thinking to solve problems, to improve society, and to make advancements in various fields, including science and politics, ethics, and philosophy. And this is a new way of thinking in Europe because, again, previously, religion, specifically in Europe's case, Christianity, really guided how people came to know about the world, right? That was the lens through which they viewed the world. And religious thinking, however, right, relies on faith, on revelation, and on spiritual experiences as pathways to knowledge, while Enlightenment thinking really emphasizes what's called empirical observation, right, or evidence-based reasoning, and the scientific method, right, really as a means to acquire knowledge about the natural world and human society. Now, on the screen here is Rene Descartes, right, a very important philosopher who is really regarded as a key figure from this period, from the emergence of modern philosophy and scientific thinking. So, the key takeaway for you here from this definition of enlightenment is that the Enlightenment era is going to bring about, pretty significant major changes to how people think about social and political ideas. So, you can see why we've kind of tied it in with previous sections at the end of Unit 4 here, because this ties in. Social structures started changing. There were challenges to state power, things like that. So, these are the things. Then this movement comes along that says you don't need your religion as your gateway to knowledge. You can have that knowledge on your own. So that's the key takeaway for you here as we continue into understanding more about what the Enlightenment is. Now, something that I've always tried to get across to you in class is that events don't just happen, right? We don't just one day wake up and decide, you know what? Scientific reason, rationality. I think this is the Enlightenment. There's things that lead us up to that. So it's really important that you understand the relationship between the periods and events that we've talked about thus far, especially with regard to European history, um, and how they relate to the Enlightenment era, right? The Renaissance period was the cultural, the artistic, the political, and economic rebirth of Europe following the medieval Dark Ages. The rediscovery of classical texts leads to major advancements in thinking and was a major factor in the Protestant Reformation that we talked about. The printing press, the Gutenberg printing press, even though we know that China really kind of started that process of printing movable type. But the Gutenberg printing press really facilitated and made possible literacy and people being able to read. And consequently, the wider spread of information among the population, right? Because now it was much more accessible. Printed books were much more accessible. And that was the fuel that allowed these new ideas to really spread. And again, going back all the way to Unit 3, the Protestant Reformation was a huge change in religious thinking in Europe. It weakened the control of the Catholic Church overall. And then the scientific revolution brought a lot of obvious scientific advancements and inventions, but the idea of empiricism or empirical thought, experimentation are what is most important here, right? Those are the things that really stand out. So all of these things together, the printing press, which makes literacy and reading more accessible to more people, the Protestant Reformation, which challenges the power of the Catholic Church. Couple that with the Renaissance, this cultural and artistic political rebirth in Europe, and then the scientific revolution, changes in understanding science and advancements and empirical thought. All of these things combined really help lead into the Enlightenment period. So before we really get into topic 5.1, we want to pause for a second here and really just make sure that we are all on the same page about the term empiricism or empirical, right? You have a question here, right, of what do you think empirical evidence? So a lot of philosophers have really gotten stuck on the question of how can we know for sure what really exists. Now, Rene Descartes here thought about that question and really came to the conclusion that he could not be sure that his own senses, right, sight, touch, hearing, etc., could be reliable, right? There certainly exists situations that feel like really real to people, but we all pretty much agree that they're not, right? Things like dreams or hallucinations, etc. Those are two examples of things that feel really real to the person who experienced it, but we all know, right, that those weren't real. So how can we be sure that what we are experiencing right now is not a dream? Or, I mean, I'm sure it's not your dream to be sitting in a classroom or watching this video, but how can we be sure that what we're experiencing now is not a dream, is not a hallucination, and is perhaps not a very strange virtual reality experience, right? How can we be so sure? And there's movies about that, like Inception, for example, I think is one that sort of plays on that question. But what Rene Descartes really felt certain about, that he did know for sure, is that he himself was in fact actually thinking something, right? He was thinking about this question. He was having this thought. So to him, that proved his existence to be real, even if he could not fully trust his own senses, right? Because according to him, right, if he did not exist, he could not possibly be thinking about whether or not he existed, right? It's a little bit confusing at first, right? If he did not exist, right, if he was not real, then why would he be thinking about whether he was real or not? Right. So I think, therefore I am, is what he said, right? That was his solution to his problem. Because I can think of this, because I have the capacity to think, therefore I am real, right? So I think, therefore I am. Um, and when we have an opportunity to in class, we'll have a bit of a thought experiment for you. I know it's in your notes. I think there's a space in your notes for that, but we'll have a thought experiment in class, and we'll discuss this question a little bit further. All right, so let's get into topic 5.1 finally here. The learning objective for this section is going to be explaining the intellectual and ideological context in which revolutions swept across the Atlantic world from 1750 to 1900. So, again, we've moved ahead in the chronology. And here, again, our focus is particularly on the Atlantic world. We're not looking at Asia. We're not looking at Africa. We're looking at the Atlantic world in this case. Most specifically, we're going to be looking particularly in Europe. But then later on, of course, we'll bring in the Americas as well. So you have your key concepts here, your historical developments. Enlightenment philosophies applied new ways of understanding and empiricist approaches to the natural world and to human relationships, and re examined the role that religion played in public life and emphasized the importance of reason. Then you have the rise and diffusion of Enlightenment thought, questioning established traditions in all areas of life, which preceded revolution. So, this spread of this thought, this enlightened thought, is what is believed to be the predecessor, the what comes before revolution. So we'll touch on that as well. And then nationalism becomes a major force shaping the historical development of states and empires. So again, if we're thinking of our thematic focus here, the thematic focus of this portion of our lecture is cultural developments, but we obviously have strong connections to social, political, and economic developments. So we'll definitely dive in pretty deep into some of these topics here. So what we'll get started with is several of the key figures of the Enlightenment that really contribute significant ideas that drive the Enlightenment forward, that fuel the Enlightenment and the revolutions that follow it. First, we come to Sir Francis Bacon. Sir Francis Bacon is widely considered to be the father of empiricism and is a key figure of both the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. His ideas, his methods really lay the groundwork for the empirical approach to knowledge that would become really central to the Enlightenment era. And he emphasizes the importance of empirical observation and something called inductive reasoning, and in the acquisition of knowledge, the acquiring of knowledge. He advocates for really like a system of methodical observation of the natural world, gathering data through experimentation, through experiments, through sensory experience, right? Being able to touch, smell, taste, observe things, right? In that method, that's what we're referring to when we talk about sensory experience. And this approach, this empirical approach, was a fundamental departure from relying on tradition, on authority, on dogma, which is religious thought, and was really characteristic of much of pre-Enlightenment thought. Now, Bacon's influential work, Novum Organum, really outlined his approach to scientific inquiry. It's in this work that he proposes this idea of inductive reasoning, where you get principles from specific observations, right? So for us today, this is like, well, duh, like I'm going to observe things, right? You guys go to science class or whatever, you do labs and experiments, you're observing things, you're recording those observations, you're writing them in reports and things like that. In the 1600s, that wasn't a thing, right? That we weren't doing that really. And you should recognize the phrase, right? He argued for the phrase knowledge is power, right? We use that all the time. And the pursuit of that knowledge should really serve a practical and utilitarian purpose for improving society. So, right, you want to think of how those ideas really on how to better society have really contributed to these political revolutions, right? Because they help people realize that the current system of government was oppressive and that there was a possibility for a better quality of life by getting rid of existing authority. The United States, we applied that to Great Britain, right? We applied that when we go into the American Revolution. We'll talk about that. Um, People around the world have applied that to their governments, and still to this day people apply that thought to their governments. They observe things, what's happening. We should be improving society. So this is where we start to see people who protest, and then people who start to turn that into a political movement and things like that. So these things still happen today. So this thought, these philosophies don't disappear. Now, so far, we've talked about these two particular figures in the context of empiricism, but how do their ideas differ, right? How are Sir Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes different? Now, Bacon and Descartes both approach empiricism in some different fundamental ways, right? Sir Francis Bacon, he advocated for systematic data collection through experiments and sensory experiences, right? His approach is more focused on accumulating this empirical data to really try to understand general principles or laws from observations. But Descartes, on the other hand, really started his philosophical journey with a more skeptical outlook, right? He famously doubted all of his sensory experiences. He doubted all of his senses, right? That's where we got to the point of like, how can I trust what I'm sensing? And then it was, well, I think, therefore I am. That was his thought. And he wanted to really establish a foundation of indubitable knowledge. And don't ask me what indubitable means, but he wanted to build up a foundation of knowledge by first doubting everything, even the existence of the outside world, and then arriving at certainty through reason, right? Reasoning. And so while he acknowledged there was importance to empirical knowledge, observable knowledge, his method started with more rational approach. So both of these, the ability to accept and rely on data and facts and observation to draw your conclusion, and the skepticism, which provides a pathway to reason to draw conclusions, are both important in furthering the ideas of the Enlightenment, even though they're fundamentally different approaches, right? You have to be able to accept the facts as they are, but then also have some doubt, right? Have some doubt so that you can reason, is what I'm observing accurate, right? Just because I've observed it, is it accurate? Is it maybe a one-off situation? Is it, something that's outside of the norm and isn't going to be something constant, right? Is this an accurate thing? So not only being able to accept the data, accept the facts, but also being skeptical of the data and trying to reason, is what I'm observing accurate, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here. Which will then bring us to Thomas Hobbes, not the comic book guy. Okay. Um, Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who lived in the 1600s and the 17th century. And he is regarded as kind of as one of the precursors to Enlightenment philosophy because of his contributions to what is called the social contract theory, right? It's this emphasis on reason, on governance, the relationship between people and the state. And so Hobbes' social contract theory is a central theme in Leviathan. Leviathan is his work here. He proposed that in a state of nature where there is no established political authority, humans exist in a condition of conflict, ongoing conflict and insecurity. And life in this state, according to Hobbes, is, nasty, brutish, short, right? It's terrible. And to escape this state of nature, individuals voluntarily come together, enter into a social contract, give up some of their natural rights and powers to a central authority, typically represented by a form of government or a sovereign. Um, and this contract is really an agreement among individuals to create a political entity for the sake of security and protecting their natural rights. Okay, so it's important for you as a student to understand social contract theory as a philosophical idea that government, that in order to secure protections and have a civilized society, you have to give up some of your rights to a central authority or a central government that protects the people and their rights, right? This is a very important idea, but keep in mind that monarchy fit into what Hobbes's view of a central authority would be, right? So social contract theory is you do give up some of your liberties, in a sense. You do give up some of your freedoms, you give up some of your rights, and not entirely, but you say, you're willing to accept the government. You're willing to accept what the government will do in a way in exchange for the government's protection of the rest of your rights. So we'll expand then on social contract theory by discussing John Locke. John Locke, also a 17th century English philosopher, whose ideas really play a pivotal role, a central role in the Enlightenment and the development of modern political thought. Now, his ideas on social contract theory, right, which we've already talked about social contract theory in the context of Thomas Hobbes, and we'll compare and contrast here in a bit. But his ideas, John Locke's ideas on social contract theory, are outlined in his famous work, which I had to read in college. So if you ever decide to take political science classes in college, you may have to read this book. But it's called Treatises of Government. Two Treatises of Government. Now, these are John Locke's key ideas here, right? Um, his key ideas about government include the thought that government isn't legitimate unless it has the consent of the governed, right? The people that it governs give it the consent. And here in America, we do that in most part by voting, right? We vote for people to represent us in Congress, in the Senate, as governor, state legislatures, mayors. We vote for people and we give them our consent by voting for them. Even though, for example, if you didn't vote for the person who's currently in office, right, you might think like, well, they don't represent me then because I didn't give them my consent. I voted for the other guy. But by participating in the system of voting, we've given our consent as people. The second key idea is that government should be limited in scope and respect the fundamental rights of people. So the government really should be as small as possible and really respect the fundamental rights of people. That's John Locke's idea. Third, it should be a system where different branches of government are responsible for different tasks and therefore limiting the potential for abuses of power. And again, Look at America. We've got three branches of government that, for the most part, historically, check each other, check and balance each other out. Doesn't always happen all of the time. You could argue it's not happening now, but that's neither here nor there, and that's a conversation for a different day. Now, fourth, he argues that individuals have a right to own the product of their work. So, if you work on the land and you produce an agricultural product, you should own that product, right? If you created a very fancy pen, I don't know, I'm looking at a pen right here. But if you created this fancy pen, you should own it, not the government, not the people. Now, his most radical idea, fifth, is that if a government fails to protect the rights and freedoms of its people, of its citizens, the people have a right to revolt and establish a new one. That fifth idea is really the basis for the American Revolution. In fact, when we get to read the Declaration of Independence, that phrase is essentially there, right? That entire phrasing is pretty much what is written in the Declaration of Independence. So when we think about it, and we're going to compare Hobbes and Locke here in just a moment, does John Locke support monarchy? No, right? He's providing a very early outline for a government that is chosen by the people, which matches this consent of the governed, and rather than a government that's led by the divine right of kings, right? So you can see where we're starting to transition this idea into a movement that will influence and inspire and ignite revolutions, right? He's also proposing limiting the powers of government and using some sort of check and balance system to prevent abuses of power, which is not how a monarchy really typically operates. And I don't think any monarchy, no king, no queen, no emperor, no anyone would support the idea that people should have the right to revolt against their government. And I couldn't think of one, right? Um, so those are John Locke's key ideas. Let's compare them with Thomas Hobbes. So that'll bring us to the end of topic 5.1. Here are the key ideas for your review here. The printing press, the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the scientific revolution contributed to the Enlightenment period, which was characterized by empiricism, rationalism, and the social contract, laissez-faire economics, deism, and other new ideas from prominent thinkers. Enlightenment thinking and nationalism will fuel the French Revolution, which we will talk more about in 5.2. And the Enlightenment thinking also changes social structures, brings about the abolition of serfdom, the abolition of slavery, and the rise for demands of women's rights. So, again, that will wrap up topic 5.1 for us. I'll see you for the next section.